I've always been fascinated by the silence of the night. While most people would retire to sleep, I felt an irresistible call to go out and explore. Night fishing always brought me a peace I couldn't find anywhere else. Thus, on a night with a full moon, I decided to venture into an isolated lake deep in the forest. The sky was clear, and the moon shone brightly, reflecting off the calm waters of the lake. The air was cold and moist, and a light mist hovered over the water's surface, creating an almost mystical scene. I could hear the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of some nocturnal animal, but other than that, the silence was absolute. It was that deep night silence, filled only by natural sounds and my own thoughts. My reasons for fishing that night were simple. I sought a moment of tranquility and introspection. There was something therapeutic about being alone in nature, just me and the elements. Sitting by the lake, with my fishing rod ready, I felt at peace, as if I was exactly where I needed to be. I've always been an experienced fisherman, but there was something different about that night. A sense of expectation, and perhaps a hint of unease. It was as if nature was whispering ancient secrets, stories of others who had passed through before me. Ignoring these thoughts, I prepared my bait and cast my line into the water, patiently waiting for the first sign of activity. As I waited, I recalled stories I had heard from older fishermen. Tales of giant, almost mythical fish that inhabited those waters and only appeared to the bravest. I didn't believe in these legends, but the idea of catching something extraordinary that night fascinated me. It would be my chance to prove to myself and others that these stories were nothing but myths. The moon climbed higher in the sky, and time seemed to stretch, each minute passing slower than the last. Looking into the dark, deep waters, I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I attributed it to the cold and the excitement of the moment. Little did I know that night was about to turn into one of the most disturbing events of my life. The night progressed, and the silence around me became almost palpable, a presence in itself. Everything was calm, except for the occasional plop of my baits hitting the water. The moon was high, its light reflected in the gentle waves that lazily rocked the lake. I was starting to relax, letting my mind wander, when something shattered the tranquility of the scene. At first, it was just a sound. A low, distant sound, as if something was moving under the water. I thought it might be a big fish, perhaps even one of the giants that fed the local legends. But soon, the sound intensified, becoming a rhythmic and measured noise, almost like a slow and steady drumbeat. My eyes scanned the lake's surface, searching for the source of that strange sound. That's when I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A short distance from my line, the water began to bubble and churn unnaturally, as if boiling on its own. The bubbles rose to the surface in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, as if something below was trying to catch my attention. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed the beam toward the bubbles. The moment the light touched the water, the sound abruptly stopped, and the bubbles disappeared, leaving the lake calm and serene again. My heart raced uncontrollably as I tried to rationalize what I had seen and heard. It could have just been a big fish, or an underground water current. But there was something about those bubbles, something about the way they rose to the surface, that told me it was none of those things. Still trying to calm myself, I stood still for a few minutes, waiting for the sound to return or the bubbles to reappear. But everything remained eerily quiet. I was about to relax again when a sudden movement in the water caught my attention. A dark shadow swiftly passed under the surface, too large to be any fish I knew. It was as if an undefined and massive form was moving through the depths of the lake, moving with surprising agility. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every sound, every movement around me seemed amplified by the darkness and the silence of the night. I could feel my instincts screaming for me to leave, but curiosity, mixed with a sense of challenge, kept me there, waiting, watching, trying to understand what was happening beneath those mysterious waters. It was then that I realized I was not alone. An invisible presence, something I couldn't see but could feel, was there with me, watching me, studying me. The feeling of being watched was intense, almost tangible, as if invisible eyes were probing me through the darkness. And at that moment, I knew that this night would be no ordinary fishing trip. Something far more sinister and unknown was about to reveal itself. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. I was completely focused on the dark waters of the lake, trying to decipher what was hidden there. My hands were cold, and I felt a constant shiver running down my spine. I decided to cast my line once more, this time a bit closer to where I had seen the shadow. I waited, my heart pounding fast, each second feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, I felt a strong, almost violent tug on my line. I almost lost my balance, but managed to steady my feet and started pulling. The resistance was tremendous, something much bigger than any fish I had ever caught. My muscles strained, and I could feel adrenaline coursing through my veins. With one final pull, I brought to the surface what was on the other end of the line. The light from the flashlight illuminated something that, at first, looked like a tangle of seaweed and mud. But as I looked closer, my blood froze. Among the seaweed, there was something solid, pale, almost translucent. It looked like a human hand. I let out a scream of horror and stepped back, almost falling backward. Trembling, I moved the flashlight closer again to make sure of what I was seeing. It wasn't just a hand, it was an entire arm, partially decomposed, with flesh hanging and bones exposed. What terrified me even more was the frozen expression of agony on the face that emerged next, with glazed eyes and a mouth open in a silent scream. I wanted to run, to escape that horrible scene, but my legs were paralyzed with fear. I forced myself to look again, trying to understand what could have caused such a dreadful death. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but something about the way it was mutilated seemed deliberate. As if something or someone had done it on purpose. Suddenly, I heard the sound of water moving, as if something large was rapidly approaching. Panic set in my mind. I frantically looked around, but the darkness seemed even denser now. I felt a presence, something very close to me, almost within my reach. That's when I saw, for a brief moment, two glowing eyes watching me from the depths, filled with a cold and inhuman intelligence. Terror overtook me. I left everything behind, the fishing rod, the flashlight, and ran as fast as I could towards the car, each step accompanied by the sensation that something was chasing me, ready to drag me back into those dark and deadly waters. A few weeks after my terrifying experience at the lake, I decided I couldn't keep it to myself. I convinced my friend Benjamin, a skeptical and adventurous fisherman, to accompany me back to the lake. I needed someone to witness what I had seen, to validate that I wasn't losing my sanity. Benjamin laughed as we prepared for the night fishing. He thought my story was just the product of a tired and imaginative mind. "You've been watching too many horror movies," he said, patting me on the back. I just smiled nervously, trying to ignore the growing fear inside me. We arrived at the lake around midnight. The moon again illuminated the water with its pale glow, and the same thin mist floated over the surface. Benjamin set up his gear with the confidence of someone who has done it thousands of times. I, however, was on high alert. Every sound and movement in the darkness felt like an omen. We cast our lines into the water and settled in to wait. The conversation was light, with Benjamin trying to distract me from my fears. But with each passing minute, I felt the tension increase. Time seemed to drag, and the night grew increasingly oppressive. Suddenly, Benjamin stood up abruptly. Hey, did you see that?" he asked, pointing to a spot on the water where small ripples were forming. I hadn't seen anything, but his tone had changed. He was no longer laughing. There was a new seriousness in his voice. Before I could answer, something pulled his line with incredible force. Benjamin struggled to balance himself, trying to hold onto the rod, but whatever was on the other end was powerful. This must be huge," he exclaimed, his voice mixed with excitement and worry. He began to reel in, his muscles tense from the effort. The water was now churning, and strange sounds echoed around us. I moved closer to help, but suddenly everything went silent. Benjamin looked at me, confused. I think I lost it, he said, breathing heavily. However, before he could release the rod, something emerged from the water with frightening speed and force. Benjamin was dragged away with unimaginable violence. In the blink of an eye, he was pulled into the lake, his scream of terror echoing in the darkness. I ran to the shore, shouting his name, but all that remained was the sound of the water calming down again. There was no sign of Benjamin. Panic overtook me. I began to run along the shore, looking for any sign of him, calling his name repeatedly. But it was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. The night seemed even darker, and the sensation of being watched returned with full force. Something in that lake had taken my friend, and I didn't know what to do. The silence after Benjamin's disappearance was deafening. Each second that passed without finding him increased my fear and despair. It was as if the lake itself had swallowed him, erasing any trace of his existence. And I knew, at that moment, that we were not welcome there. Benjamin's disappearance left me paralyzed for a moment that seemed like an eternity. My heart raced uncontrollably, and my mind whirled, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I needed to act quickly, but terror kept me rooted to the ground. Finally, I managed to move. I ran to the car, trying to reach my phone to call for help. Each step felt like a battle against the invisible force that seemed to want to keep me there. When I finally got into the car and grabbed the phone, I realized there was no signal. We were too far from any civilization. Fear turned into despair. I got out of the car and returned to the lake's edge, hoping to find some sign of Benjamin. I shouted his name repeatedly, my voice echoing in the silent night. But the only sound that returned was that of the calm waters, as if mocking my desperation. Then I heard it again, that bubbling sound drawing closer. Panic made me run away from the shore, but something made me stop and look back. The water was agitated once again, but this time, a dark figure slowly emerged. It was Benjamin, or at least something that resembled him. His face was pale, and his eyes were glassy, empty. He moved strangely, as if being controlled by some malevolent force. My survival instinct screamed for me to run, but part of me wanted to help him, even knowing something terrible was happening. As I hesitated, the figure of Benjamin began to advance toward me, his movements awkward and frightening. Each step he took increased my fear, and I finally gave in to panic. I turned and ran through the forest, my legs moving as fast as they could. The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow me, and each branch that brushed against my face or caught on my clothes was a new challenge. The sound of Benjamin's awkward footsteps followed me, getting closer and closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my breath was labored. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but adrenaline kept me upright. I knew I needed to find a way to escape this nightmare. I pushed forward through the forest, trying to remember the way back to the car, but everything looked the same in the darkness. The feeling of being hunted was intense, as if the night itself was alive and against me. Finally, I saw a small clearing ahead, lit by the moon. I ran towards it, hoping it was a path to freedom. But when I arrived, I realized I was surrounded by tall, imposing trees, as if they were forming a natural prison. I heard a sound behind me, and turning around, I saw the figure of Benjamin, now much closer. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his distorted smile was the image of pure terror. There was nowhere to run, and the clearing seemed to close in around me. My despair peaked. I picked up a stone from the ground and threw it towards Benjamin, hoping to slow him down. But the stone passed through him as if he were made of mist. The threat was real and inescapable. At that moment, I knew I had to face my fear head-on, fighting with all the strength I had left to survive. I gathered all the courage I could muster and prepared for the inevitable confrontation with the unknown. My only thought was to survive and somehow escape from that seemingly endless night. That night seemed infinite, but somehow, I survived. When dawn finally broke, I found myself staggering back to my car, exhausted and in shock. My body was covered in scratches and bruises, the result of a desperate race through the forest. Every muscle ached, and my mind was a whirlwind of terrifying images and sounds. I arrived in town like a ghost, a shadow of what I had been before. People looked at me with curiosity and concern, but no one could understand the depth of my trauma. Benjamin was missing, and the story I had to tell was so absurd that no one believed it. I tried to explain what happened to the authorities, but my accounts were met with skepticism. They organized searches, but found no trace of Benjamin or whatever was in the lake that night. To them, he was just another missing person, and I, a man shaken by tragedy. Life returned to normal for everyone except me. The nights became unbearable. Sleep, when it came, was invaded by vivid nightmares. The figure of Benjamin, with his empty eyes and macabre smile, haunted my dreams. I would wake up in cold sweat, a scream caught in my throat, reliving that moment of terror over and over again. During the day, I avoided the lake and any mention of fishing. The sight of water, even if it was just a simple river or a pool, brought back the panic. I became reclusive, distancing myself from friends and family. Solitude was my only companion, and the silent house seemed a safe refuge, far from the shadows that seemed to follow me. Therapy was a challenge. I tried to seek professional help, but explaining the experience coherently was nearly impossible. Therapists looked at me with the same disbelief as the police, and the feeling of being judged prevented me from opening up completely. The sessions were frustrating, an endless cycle of trial and error that did little to alleviate the trauma. Physically, I was deteriorating. The lack of sleep and constant state of alert took their toll. I lost weight, my appetite decreased, and my hands trembled constantly. The doctor diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress, prescribing medications that only numbed the pain without really curing it. The people around me began to drift away. Close friends didn't know how to deal with my erratic behavior and disturbing stories. My family, though concerned, felt powerless. Isolation became a self-imposed prison, and each day that passed seemed like an echo of that night by the lake, a constant reminder of the horror I had faced. Over time, I learned to live with the fear. I accepted that some wounds never fully heal and that certain experiences leave a permanent mark on us. The lake, a serene and peaceful place for many, had transformed into my own personal nightmare, a place that haunted every thought and every beat of my heart. Benjamin's disappearance remained a mystery, and I, a lost soul caught between two realities, the normality of everyday life and the indescribable terror of that fateful night. And so, living among shadows and memories, I continued, carrying the indelible mark of the unknown on my mind and body, forever altered by the darkness of the lake.